Hello and welcome to Tienery. Well, that is of course my name, as well as of course my website. Now in this new tutorial series, what I'm going to show you is an update for my website tienery.biz, my personalized business website, which looks like this. I want to update it, but at the same time what I'd like to also do is provide some HTML5 and CSS3 tutorials along the way. Why do I want to update this? Well, currently my working environment is actually very poor. The way that I'm doing it is I'm just working in just one folder, and that's not a very good way of doing it. Normally what you would have is a development copy and that's the recording folder. I don't want to go there. What I'd like is inside of my folders here is two folders ideally, so I would have this development directory here and then another directory that says tienery.biz new production, for example. So you wouldn't touch the production unless you wanted to update it, right? And that's not what I've been doing. If we take a look into here, this is basically more up-to-date version of this, but this is the only copy. This is just a blog, but because of that, I'm implementing lots and lots of features, but I want to update this at the same time, right? And because of that, the only way I can really do it is to copy another, is to go from the FTP server, go into the FTP server, download the files that currently exist into a new folder, which would be the production site, and this would become the development site, right? Now, I would do that, but I've been thinking, well, first of all, I want to change a few things around. I want to manage my website a lot easier. I want to develop my own software to do that, and I want to also make a more robust solution for managing all of the content on my website. So I don't really want to work with purely HTML files. I think that's a bit tedious, and obviously there are solutions to work around that. So you've got things like Markdown, for example, and that is indeed what I'm going to be using, and I'm going to be helping you learn in these tutorials. With regards to tutorials then, I would like to show you a few development resources that would be very, very useful if you're just starting out. So obviously these tutorials will be catered toward people who haven't done HTML5 or CSS3 at all. Now, one particular resource which is very, very useful is the Mozilla Developer Network, which contains, when this internet finally loads, which contains web API references. So we've got reference API references here, CSS, JavaScript, HTML. It's a fantastic resource, much better than W3 Schools, in my opinion. And obviously we've got our APIs here for JavaScript, so if we wanted to do something with JavaScript later on, which of course we will be doing, then we will be using much of this. So we will be getting used to searching for things in here to see where we go with that. And we will be using things like jQuery, for example, later on. That'll become very, very useful, so we'll be doing stuff like this. And of course, Markdown.js, should I say. Actually, there's a specific marked.js. There we go. So there's a specific project that I prefer to use, Marked. It's possibly the easiest to use because it's just a case of typing in Marked. That's it, literally. All of the other, well, I don't get it for JavaScript. I mean, this is great because it provides you with this file and it doesn't force you to use npm, right? You don't need to use npm. It's just a case of download this file and then you're done, right? If you want to use Node.js, then you probably want to use npm perhaps, although I generally would go against using Node.js anyway. But again, that's my opinion. I don't like the Node.js culture. I think it's bad programming practice, that culture. Just my opinion. I'm sure a lot of people will say, "Oh no, he's a Node.js hater" or whatever. People getting triggered and all that. But anyway, so we're going to be starting with some HTML and CSS tutorials to get started. These are the main resources that I'll be using. MDN will be the most useful for our specific tutorials as we get started here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this folder. I'm going to open this up and I'm going to type brackets / You might think, why would I want to do that? The reason why is because it does this. So we open brackets and it automatically goes to this folder, right? And that is a lot easier than navigating to the folder this way. That's just how I roll. You can do it a different way if you wish, but this is how I do it. So I've got a basic folder structure here. I've just got image and a favicon.ico just to get started. I didn't want to bore you with graphic drawing, so I thought I'd just draw a logo to get started. So in here I'm going to type index.htm. Now in web design, or when you deploy your website onto a web server, the first thing that the HTTP or the web server is going to do is it's going to find, or the web browsers as I say, is going to find index.htm, index.php, or anything similar to it. For .NET applications, it can also be default.aspx. That obviously depends on whether you're using C# or not. We're not going to be using C# for these tutorials, but if those are if that's the language that you want to use, then that's entirely up to you. And you can change things around, like say in Apache, for example, you can actually change which of the default files that you can navigate to. You can also use htaccess, which is this file here. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial because that's beyond this tutorial for the time being, but it may be something that we go to at a later point. I'm not very good with htaccess anyway, so I probably won't touch on it until I'm much more comfortable with it. So once we've started and created this index.htm file, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate this live previewing, which is going to open up Google Chrome. That's actually going onto my other screen, so it's not actually showing me exactly what I want to see. So let's go ahead and bring it side by side just so that you can see both at the same time. Okay. Now, the first things first, we are using what's called tags. Now these are what's called tags. This is an open tag, and obviously that's a closed tag. And This is a specific declaration at the top of the page, and we need this because the browser is going to determine what version of HTML we're using. We can add some options to it as well. So this tells the browser we're using HTML5. Now, this isn't particularly important for modern browsers these days because most browsers are intelligent enough to know what version of HTML you're using and adapt accordingly. But for Internet Explorer, if you do not specify this, it's going to default to HTML4. Now, I'm not 100% sure on that because, again, depending on the version of Internet Explorer that you're using, it might just be clever enough to know exactly what version of HTML you are using. But I do remember in the past when I did do HTML, you could define the language, the sort of the different options within this doc type parameter. It's quite complicated. Again, the MDN resource is pretty much your friend in this regard. So let's go to our useful search functionality here. So if we were to type in doc type, for example. So it says here in HTML the doc type is required. Is the required preamble found at the top of all documents, and its the sole purpose is to prevent a browser from switching into a so-called quirks mode when rendering a document. So in other words, if a web browser is opening a HTML document and it doesn't have this doc type at the top, it's going to assume which version of HTML you're using, and it can cause some issues down the line. That's especially true with older versions of Internet Explorer. So just be sure that you put that at the top of every single one of your HTML documents, otherwise you will end up with problems. The next tag we're going to use is HTML. This is the basis for all of your HTML documents. This is the root, and it is the page declaration. This is this white screen here with nothing on it right now. The next thing I'm going to do is open a head tag, and this basically gives us access to page options. So what we can do in here is we can set the title of the document. We can set some meta information such as the author, copyright information, a description. This is mainly useful for search engine optimization, but not necessarily useful for our purposes right now. We can also add scripts and link CSS, which we will be using soon. So first things first, I'm going to put in the title, and I'm going to call it Tienery Co. Oops. I'm just going to keep it like that for now. And as you can see over here, we've got our logo here, and we've got our title that has been updated there. Now, you can use Google Fonts if you want. I'm not going to for these tutorials, simply because just because it's easier not to use it, I guess. I just prefer to use native tutorials because fonts, because you're not relying on a third-party service in order to keep it up together, maintained. I mean, it is Google. You would expect it to be maintained, but you never know. I mean, they are still a multinational corporation. We have seen multinational corporations decide to pull things off their servers, and suddenly your fonts on your website no longer work. So you never know. At some point in the future, Google Fonts might disappear. I might be very skeptical, but yeah, it's just something to think about, right? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open another tag. I'm going to call it link. Now this will allow us to access a style sheet, which is our CSS style sheet. Now I don't have one created yet, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's create a folder in here. I'm going to call it styles, and inside of here I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call it main.css. So let's go back here. Let's pass in our styles, main.css, rel style sheet. Now you can do this if you want, but it kind of knows what you're using anyway when you use rel is equal to style sheet. Now you're going to notice some differences here. As you see here, here and here, these have open and close tags. Now this is a close tag because it's got a / in here. This is closing the tag of head. This is closing the tag of HTML. This is closing the tag of title, right? Inside link, we don't need to close it. It's sort of a self-closing tag. Now you can do that, which means that it's self-closing, meaning we don't need to do link. In fact, that doesn't work, right? HTML doesn't interpret that. But we can do that. Now we can do this for backward compatibility to older browsers, and when I say older browsers I mean much older, but we don't need to do that. We can just do this, okay? So that's fine. We can then go ahead and start doing some CSS in a moment, but the last thing we want to do is add the body. This is where we put our content in. Now, I'm not going to add content right now because I don't need to, because there's one thing that I want to mention. Now, certain browsers like Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, they all have different paddings and margins already set up by default within the HTML page. So how do we go about resetting it? What we can do is we can use the asterisk, which is basically a wildcard. What that's going to do is it's going to select every single element these are tags, but every single element, element that we put inside of our body, anything that can be displayed on the screen, that is, we're going to select all of those, and we're going to set the padding to 0 and the margin to 0. I do this all of the time. The reason being is because, as I just mentioned, every single web browser has different default padding and margin parameters, and in order to reset that, all we do is just select everything on the screen, make sure the padding and margin is set to 0 to make sure that we don't run into any rendering problems with certain web browsers. Okay, awesome. So now that that's out of the way, we can actually do some coding.